Hello, and welcome to another episode of Rustacean Station. I'm your host, Alan Wyma. Today I'm with David Pedersen, who is the creator of Axum, right? So to me, Axum is this mysterious web framework that appeared, apparently it's been out for a year, and I didn't even notice it's been out for that long. I kind of just flew underneath my radar one day. Saw people were talking about it on Reddit, and so I really kind of want to know a little bit more about Axum. And yeah, why don't you talk about it first? David, go ahead.
Yeah, hello. Thanks for having me. So Axum is, I guess you could call it, it's sort of the official Tokio web framework in a way. So it's a web framework created by me that's under the Tokio umbrella. So many people think of Tokio as just the Tokio runtime, the crate called Tokio, but Tokio is much wider than that. Hyper is part of Tokio. Tonic is a gRPC implementation that's part of Tokio. Tower, there's a couple of utility libraries. Tracing is part of Tokio as well. So Axum sort of fits underneath that umbrella. And Axum exists in sort of the same space as like Actix Web or Rocket or Warp, those kinds of frameworks.
Now, we got basically nearly, like, if you're not using Tokio, it's kind of like
Yes.
you're not doing it right or something. I don't know. It's kind of what I feel like. And so why is it that we actually need a web framework underneath the Tokio umbrella?
Well, so Tokio is just an async runtime. So like you can read and write from async like network streams, but that's super low level. So you need something on top of that. Typically that's Hyper, that's the HTTP implementation. But Hyper, similarly to Tokio, is also quite low level. So if you as an application developer actually want to get stuff done, doing that directly with Hyper, while possible, is kind of a pain. You can totally do it if you just need like one or two routes. But as soon as you want anything more fancy than that, you kind of want a framework to deal with most of the boilerplate for you. So that's kind of what Axum is.
I understand that part, right? But like when I'm saying Tokio umbrella, like if you go to Tokio RS, I think it is, there is like a ton of different packages, right? You got, is it called Requests? I can't remember the name. It's not called Requests. Yeah, Requests, but spelled with a W, right? You got Tokio, you got Bytes, which people don't really talk about. I think there's one or two more besides Axum. Now, what I'm saying is like, to me, those things are kind of like cogs that you put into your machine, but a web framework is much more than that, right? It's a framework, right? Not just like a piece, because you're also using the request things built by Arthur, right?
Yes, I don't quite see it like that. I definitely think there is space for a web framework in there. I think many people make the assumption that all the crates that are in the Tokio umbrella sort of require the Tokio runtime. So like that is not the case. Like you can use tracing or bytes or whatever without the Tokio runtime. Technically, you can also use Hyper without the Tokio runtime if you want to. But Tokio already has things like Tonic, which is sort of a gRPC web framework where Axum sits sort of next to Tonic. So I definitely think there is space for a web framework in that sense.
Well, I mean, if you take a look, right? Sorry, I just want to kind of push this just a little bit more, right? So you have, okay, Stack, which is not really something runtime. Okay, Hyper. Okay, fine. Tokio runtime, right? Hyper, Tonic, Tower, Mio. I forgot how do you say it. Tracing, Bytes. These are all kind of pieces, but a framework is really like taking all these pieces and putting them together to make something cohesive and together, right? I feel like it's much more than just a piece that you would add to your app or whatever, if that makes sense to you. To me, like those, like I think about Rails, I think about like when you have a Rails, you have a Rails app. For most frameworks, you have that kind of app. So that's why I feel like it's much more than just a piece of Tokio. That's why I felt a little bit strange that it does much more than one thing necessarily. I don't know. That's just my feeling, right? But you're saying, no, we don't think about it like that. We think about it as kind of a piece of the Tokio ecosystem, right?
Yes, exactly. I think like you can also like Rails is very sort of a like a holistic framework. Like you wouldn't have, I don't know, some larger ecosystem, like some larger application kind of thing where Rails is like one part of it. Rails is typically, that's the whole part. But Axum and most Rust framework are sort of very minimal. So if you want like, I don't know, you have some kind of fancy app where like a part of it is just serving HTTP requests. Maybe you want to do like OAuth handoff kind of thing, and you just need a tiny little HTTP server with like a couple of routes. You could totally do Axum for that and just embed it inside your application. But I don't really feel like you could do that with Rails. It's like Rails is much bigger in scope in that sense.
Yeah, so that's the funny thing is like I feel like nowadays maybe, or maybe that's just my interpretation, is that people are taking web frameworks and they're really stripping them down to basically, like you said, like more like an interface rather than an app, right? So like we talk about what you just said. Like I remember when I used to work on Rails, it's like, okay, I have a Rails app, so I need to use a Rails plugin. Now, I mean, I do more Elixir nowadays, so it's like now I no longer say I need a Phoenix plugin. It's just I just need something that does works in Elixir. And like you said with Rust, it's also the same thing. I need something that works for what I need. except for the caveat is, does this thing work with Tokio? That's the only issue that you usually need to run into. And 90% of the time, that's basically it, unless you're doing something very specialized.
Yeah.
Or you want to write that piece yourself, right?
I think definitely there is space for a Rails-ish kind of framework in Rust. I think it takes a long time to get there, and I think there's a lot of pieces that we kind of need to figure out. Personally, I see Axum both as a framework that you can use on your own, but I also see Axum as a framework or a library that you can build higher level stuff on top of. So I think if you wanted to build a Rails kind of thing for Rust, I think Axum would be a really good thing to base that on top of. And that's part of the sort of design ideas behind Axum's APIs, that it has to be easy to abstract on top of Axum.
Okay, so I think there's basically two big pieces to any major framework for web in Rust, right? And that's usually Tokio, of course, and Hyper, right?
Yeah.
Now, can we talk about the pieces of Axum? Like, what are the batteries that are included within Axum? Like, when I say I have an Axum web, I'm using the Axum web framework, right? What kind of things can I expect from it out of the box?
Well, you can expect routing. You can expect things like, we have this similar concept that Actix Web has called extractors. So different ways to sort of parse the request, get headers, shared state, forms, parse the query parameters or bodies, JSON bodies or whatever you want. WebSockets, let's see, async, service and events. Yeah, I think the big thing to Axum is that we try to be quite conservative with what we include in the box, and instead build APIs that people can use to build things on top of that they want to. So we could include template rendering in the box if we wanted to. We just haven't done it because you can very easily or somewhat easily integrate your own library. But you're definitely right. There are some pieces like WebSockets, for example. We choose to build WebSockets into Axum. Technically, we don't have to. I have several crates that add WebSockets to Axum, but with a slightly different API. But yeah, so if you look at like the actual things that are in the box, it's really not very much. Typically, you have to roll your own if you want more like advanced things.
Okay, it's pretty minimal. I mean, like if I want to add a web interface, I mean, it's how do I say this? It's easy to add this to my existing application, right? So say if I have a CLI app and I want to be able to say embed this into a web app just for some people, right? Like, am I looking at
Yeah,
like significant rewrite, or I mean, I guess it depends on how I structure my app too, right?
yeah. Ideally, it wouldn't be that hard, but it definitely depends on how you structure your app. If you're familiar with like Warp and Actix, the stuff that's included in the box with Axum is basically the same thing. I'm not aware of anything that any of the other frameworks have that we don't have. We have an example in the repo that integrates with, I forget what the name of the templating library is called, but it's fairly easy to add that yourself.
Yeah, I find it so interesting that like so many frameworks are so light. I don't know if is that just kind of like the Rust way? Is that just be as minimal as possible?
I think so. I think there's definitely an element of that to it. I think it's also just, honestly, I think it's easier. Like if you want to make a web framework, and if you want to make a competitor Rails, like that takes a long time. There's a lot of decisions that you have to make. But if you have an idea for a web framework that's cool and you want to like ship it and get it out the door and get feedback, it's much easier if you do all those features later, in a sense. We have a crate called Axum Extra, which are sort of additional features on top of Axum that aren't included in the main Axum crate, but are like extra things that you could want to. So it has like a different kind of routing setup that you can play around with. So yeah, like templating, for example, we could definitely put in there. Cookie parsing is also a thing that is in Axum Extra, but not in Axum itself. That's also a chance for us to sort of play around with what we want the API and the interface to look like before we migrate it to the Axum crate itself.
Okay. I'm actually, like I mentioned before, I'm still kind of skeptical about why this is inside of Tokio, as you can hear. And I don't think I'm ever going to get over that. Maybe I need to play around with Axum a little bit to, to know more. I kind of want to know, like, because I felt like, you guys had Tokio and Hyper. And, like, what was the discussion that kind of came out? It's like, okay, you know what? Yeah, we got these other frameworks out there, but is it like nobody knows how to actually really use Hyper to its core? So we got to like show them by making our own framework, or like, what was the discussion that you guys decided to roll your own framework?
So the idea for me that I had in the beginning was that I discovered Tower and thought that that was really cool and solved a lot of problems that I had. And I was kind of thinking, what could a web framework look like that was sort of deeply integrated with Tower in a way that the other web frameworks weren't? So that was sort of the hook for me. And then I was talking to Carl Lurch, the creator of Tokio, and he also had some ideas around what a Tokio sort of tower web framework could look like. And Warp is probably the closest to Axum because it's created by Sean, who also creates Hyper. But Warp has a very sort of, I think Warp has a really cool and interesting API, but it also has some rough edges, and there's definitely some usability difference, some usability things with Warp if you're not used to that kind of functional style programming almost. So it was really taking like a tower sort of first approach to how to build a web framework, and then doing that on top of Hyper. So if you want to be really pedantic, Axum doesn't actually know anything about Hyper. Axum knows about Tower, and Hyper also knows about Tower. So if a week from now there's a new HTTP implementation that also supports Hyper, it gets Axum support out of the box, basically.
Yeah, Tower, right? I do remember hearing about Tower. Tower's somewhat recent, right? Like, anyways, it's got a lot of stuff in it. It's built on top of Hyper, right? Like you said.
No, I think Tower is fairly old, actually. I'm not sure if it predates Hyper or if it's from around the same time. It's all built by many of the same people, so the history is kind of fuzzy there. Tower is basically a request response trait. It's basically a trait for describing things that can take a request and asynchronously produce a response. And then you can build a bunch of stuff on top of that. And it's sort of how Hyper treats your application. So like you give Hyper a Tower service, and then Hyper can just run that on top of HTTP.
You're embarrassing me by telling me I'm always wrong, but it's okay. My history, as we talked about before the show, in Rust is not that good, but okay. I'm just trying to remember like what everything was. It's been a while.
No, I definitely think that as a newcomer to the ecosystem, I think that bit can be confusing. And I don't think currently today we do a good enough job of telling how the different, like what the job of each crate is and how all the pieces sort of fit together. That's something that we still have to get better at in our documentation and on the website and all that. So I don't think you're wrong in not understanding what all the things are. I vividly remember not understanding Tower myself either. So I've definitely been there.
Okay. Yeah. I mean, if you don't work with all these things within the Tokio ecosystem, I think it's hard to kind of keep up because you're like, wait a minute, Tonic. Tonic also is, like you said, sorry, I don't think you said this, but just gRPC client.
Yeah,
I don't think I've ever had a really need for gRPC client server before. So this is all new to me. Like, yeah, okay. It just takes a while. Like I need to spend some time on this once I get a moment. So I'm actually heading back to the US in July for about a month and a half. So if anybody in the audience wants to meet up, and let me know because I'm still planning out my trip. Sorry, David, I'm not going to Denmark anytime soon. So maybe next year.
You should come. Maybe you can do some gRPC on the plane.
Yeah, but when am I going to gRPC too? I guess to myself. Maybe I can. Yeah, it's about, oh man, I think it's about 17 hours or something. It's crazy.
Yeah, okay.
All right. So, like you said, to get an idea about what Axum is like, it's really, like you said, Warp is probably the best comparison, right?
I think yes and no. I think Warp in the sense that it sort of is designed to be used with Hyper and Tokio, but I think API wise and what the code looks like, I think it's closer to Actix actually than it is Warp. Warp is like very different from the other frameworks in that, like how the filter system kind of works. Axum is more similar to Actix and Rocket.
Actually, speaking of Rocket, Rocket is like that Rails framework that we're talking about, right? Or am I wrong? Because that's what I understand about Rocket.
So I've worked with Rails for more than 5 years, and I would not say that Rocket is like Rails. I would say that Rocket is the closest that we have, but I don't think it's quite there. I feel like Rails does way more stuff, like background jobs, for example. It's not a thing that Rocket has. I think Rocket has, I'm not sure, does Rocket have templating? I'm not sure. I think it does. Definitely has database, which Rails obviously does as well. I think you're right in that Rocket has the most batteries, but I wouldn't call Rocket like a full stack framework in the same sense that like Rails is.
But I thought, like, to me, it's like a batteries included. It's like, okay, what should I use for templating language? Oh, we got that solved for you already. What do you want to use for this and that? It's like they already kind of pull the pieces together, no? That's what I think about when I think about Rails. It's like you don't need to build your own for all these small things.
I think they definitely have more pieces than the other frameworks do, but there's a lot of pieces that Rails has that Rocket doesn't have.
Yeah, true. I mean, yeah.
The Rocket has the biggest scope in that sense.
Yeah, this is true. I don't doubt that part. Okay. So initially you guys had the discussion about, yeah, there's room in the ecosystem for this, but like, I feel a little bit worried about this in Rust. And I noticed this, if you listen to This Week in Rust, I'm on the show. And I think it was the last episode that just got released was my concern about Like there's this concern. It's like, okay, do we build another thing if it's not the right thing for us? Or should we just contribute upstream, right? And you guys went the former route. Do you think that's the right way to do this? I mean, because like you said, if warp is similar, should it make sense for you guys just to contribute to warp and maybe bring warp underneath the Tokyo umbrella? Or what is your opinion about that?
So we had some usability concerns with warp. We think warp is really cool, sort of technically and almost like academically. Personally, I want to understand how warp works because I think it's really cool that you can even make code like that work at all. But I think for like often the beginners, like new people to Rust who come from web, often their first library that they've reached for is a web framework. So I think that sort of needs to have a very familiar interface, which for me personally means that warp is just a no-go because unless you come from Haskell or Scala, you're not going to understand what's going on. And the type errors can be really annoying. So then we were like, Actix has a service trait, but it's not Tower. And since Actix is stable, it's really hard to change. So we kind of felt like our only option was to make one from scratch, basically. And Actix, the names are too similar. Actix is also not based on Hyper, which we would obviously want.
Yes, I forgot about this. We talked about this with Rob Eid. I totally forgot. It's not on Hyper, which is one of the oddballs.
Yes. I think it's the only one probably that isn't on Hyper. I feel like most frameworks these days are on Hyper.
Yeah, which is really
for
weird.
better or worse.
It kind of reminds me of like that whole rack situation in Rails, right? It's like, okay, you have to use rack. And that's what actually kind of what I think I understand about. I think when I talked to Arthur, I think he also said something like this. It's kind of like there's like a standard or something, and that's why we're using this style. Maybe I remember. It's been months since I did the interview with him, so I forgot.
Yeah. I think there's also an element of it's much easier to make like a router than it is to make an HTTP implementation. So if you want to make a framework, it's much easier to just use Hyper because then you can get to the interesting stuff faster.
Yeah, it definitely. I mean, man, who was I talking to? Maybe Arthur also said this too, but it was like, by the way, if you guys don't know who Arthur's the creator of Hyper. We did an episode with him a long time ago, so you can check it out if you're interested to know more about Hyper. But I do remember, like, maybe it was the guy from Curl, the first episode I did. But I remember, like, we were talking about, like, okay, the spec says this, but that doesn't mean that's actually what the industry does. And also, the spec says it should do this, but that doesn't mean that's what it also does. Should is just like an advisory. And so building like an HTTP, like you said, building an HTTP client or even server from scratch is painful because there's a lot of wiggle room in there and you have to handle it. The web just doesn't change.
Yep. Yeah, welcome to the web. I definitely trust, I think his name is Sean from Hyper. I think his name is Sean MacArthur.
Oh, Sean MacArthur, sorry.
I definitely trust him to get the low-level details more correct than myself. So
again, correction. Thank you for correcting me yet again. It's Sean MacArthur, not Arthur. Sorry, it's end of day for me. It's 9:30 p.m. over here. I had a long day today. Yeah. And talk about requests, right? I was confusing Hyper with requests, which is another library that he did, which actually also can and doesn't have to run on Tokio. So it's called requests, REQWEST.
Yes. So request is like, so Hyper has both a server and a client implementation. And then Axum is obviously on the server side and request is on the client side. So that's like a high-level HTTP client interface that's built on top of Hyper's low-level client implementation.
Everything's built on top of Hyper, I feel like.
It's all layers and layers.
Yeah, no, but it's good that we're reusing components, right?
Yeah.
Okay, so you guys did your specking. You said, okay, there's room in the ecosystem for another framework. Why? Because we feel that the current offerings are not good enough. You said specifically like with Warp, it's close, but no cigar because we don't really like the interface. It's more Haskell like you said. Not really. Would you call it Rust idiomatic like is what you're looking for, right?
Yeah, I think so. I think it's just about what's familiar to people.
Okay. Now, what was the first piece that you guys actually made? Because I mean, there's a lot to make, right? I mean, is it just like the routing layer or like what was the first piece?
Yeah, so I actually remember I was like hacking away a weekend and I really wanted a sort of a router that didn't know anything about what your handler functions actually did. So like we could write just the router on its own, test that. It doesn't know anything about JSON or content types or whatever. It just knows about URIs basically. And then I was playing around with how you could sort of separate those two as much as possible. And then I remembered the Bevy, the game engine, actually had in its entity component system implementation it had a way to basically sort of query the environment or the state in the engine itself almost via function arguments. And I was like, that would be cool, because then you could just like, your function could just say that it expects a header or a JSON body. And then the framework Axum can sort of figure out how to get that, but the router itself doesn't need to know. And then I looked at how that was done in Bevy, and I realized that that sort of fit perfectly with the model that I needed, where you have that sort of high amount of separation. And then later realized that ActX Web actually has the exact same thing, but the original inspiration for that was Bevy actually. So yeah, then we worked on the router and figure out like we did several prototypes of what the API is going to look like. So just what are the names of the methods that you call, where are the arguments, can you like what's the syntax when you take a parameter in the URL, like /user/:IT we went with. Do you support wildcards, regexes, all these kinds of things?
Yeah, there's a lot of pieces involved, like you said. I don't even know where the heck to start. I mean, okay, so you guys kind of start from, you do most of your design kind of from like the programmer perspective. Is that how I can kind of say, where it's like, okay, I need this piece next, or how did you kind of? I'm still trying to understand, how would I even get started with something like this, and how would you know which one to work on next?
I think it was a matter of getting the basics in terms of just routing in first, and then building very flexible interfaces on that. So like if you can route to functions that just take a request, like that's basically a web framework in and of itself, because then the user just receives the request and they can do whatever they want. I'm like, oh, I would actually like receiving JSON. You can do that by just parsing the body yourself, but it's kind of annoying. So let's build a piece that does just that. Or like, you often have to parse query params. You can do that yourself in a low-level way, but let's build a more high-level thing for that. And then we basically applied that to most of the sort of common things that you have to do. WebSockets, headers, server-sent events, those kinds of things. So we sort of built like the fundamentals first and made sure that basically whatever users want to do outside of maybe routing, they can do that. Like once the request reaches their handler. And then it's just about building sort of high-level utility APIs on top of that people can use to actually be productive in their work.
Now, how do you guys actually test this all out? Like, are you guys building your own applications, or are you just kind of throwing it out there and say, request for comment? Or how do you guys actually test your assumptions? Because like what works for you may not work for others, right?
Honestly, it's a lot of if I like it, and if the other people that are helping out with reviewing Axum PRs also like it, then we ship it. We don't have a complicated process for like getting feedback or anything like that. I've worked in web a long time in many different languages, so I've kind of been around and seen the kinds of things that work and don't work. But there's a lot of like personal choice and like style to it, definitely. We do have quite a lot of people on Discord who ask questions and give feedback. So most of the design, in the early days, it was mostly what we kind of thought would work. But these days, most of the design decisions and the changes that we make actually come from people's questions. Often I'm like, I've received this question 4 or 5 times. It seems like there's a rough edge of the API here. How can we make that easier in a way and just sort of make it work in the way that people would expect, or make this problem go away? Things like that.
But this is the tricky part, right? Because expectations are, what you expect and what I expect could really be 2 different things. So how do you kind of judge what's expected and not?
Honestly, I think you just have to make a choice and try to reason with yourself why you're doing it this way and not this way. And then if someone doesn't like the way you did it, either they can pick another framework, or in terms of Axum, they can build their own thing.
Yes, that's true. So the framework's been out for about 1 year already. Like, it's been in development for obviously much longer, right? So it's been kind of 1.0, and since then for 1 year. Is that correct?
It's not 1.0. The current version is 0.5.
Wow, that's such a low number, I think, for a year, no?
It was in development for, I think I hacked on it for 2 months, something like that, before we did 0.1.
Okay, so 0.1. I mean, is it actually production ready? Because it's not even 1.0 yet.
Yeah, so version numbers and production readiness is a place where people have a lot of opinions. Axum is definitely production ready. I do use it in production at work. If you're using Tonic, Axum is actually inside of Tonic, so then you're also using Axum. So yeah, I would definitely say that it's production ready, while the API is not stable yet. There's a lot of work currently going on to get Hyper to be 1.0 this year. There's some talk of also getting Tower to 1.0, and those are things that have to happen before Axum itself can be 1.0, because Axum is like built on Hyper and Tower. It's something that we want to do eventually, but currently, since it's only been out a year, we're still every few months making breaking changes to the API. So we're not quite ready for a 1.0 yet.
Wow. Okay. I didn't even know that Hyper's not even 1.0, but I knew that. So basically, the only thing that's within the whole umbrella of Tokio is that Tokio's 1.0. Is everything else not quite 1.0 yet?
Yeah, Tokio is the only one. I think Bytes is also 1.0. But many other pieces in Tokio are web things that are like built on top of Hyper. So like Tonic cannot be 1.0 because of Hyper. Request cannot be 1.0 because of Hyper. Axum, same. Tower, same-ish. But I mean, Rust library is also, I feel like a 1.0, given the sort of what it means for the Rust language to be 1.0 and the kind of stability guarantees that they have, kind of trickles out to like library maintainers kind of feel the same way. That once you go 1.0, personally, I feel like you have to be able to, it's not that it's more serious at this point, but I feel like going 1.0 without giving any guarantees about the API is going to be stable for a year or 3 years or whatever. What's the point? If you go 1.0 and then you ship 2.0 a week later, what does it mean to be 1.0 and how is that different from being 0.5? But I definitely get people's concern about that. But I'm like, if you value stability, then Actix Web is probably a better choice for you because there are still going to be breaking changes to Axum while we figure out the API.
Actually, that's the funny thing though, because I did buy and I was trying to go through the book from Luca, and I had Rob Eid, sorry, on the show. And apparently there was a lot of rewrites of the book for quite some time because Actix Web was having an issue of deciding their API for the next version. I think they're on 2.0 now or something. They made some pretty big changes and it was a big problem.
Yeah, I think it's 4.0 actually. I'm not quite
Is it
sure.
4? Okay, yeah. So I just remember this coming up quite a bit, so I can understand what you mean. Like, but I mean, how do you decide when you're actually kind of ready to say, okay, this is stable? How do you actually know that?
Honestly, I don't know. I think I don't know how it was for Tokio. I was not around. I was not part of the Tokio team when Tokio went 1.0. I think it's a matter of how long has the current like version been out. I think there's a lot of like just like gut feeling to it. What are the kinds of questions that people are having? What are the kinds of issues that people are having? What are the kinds of changes that people that like the maintainers want to make? I think for Tokio specifically, I think there was also a bit of industry pressure for Tokio to go 1.0 because there's so many things that are built on top of Tokio that want to go 1.0. Same way for Hyper. Yeah, I don't know. It's definitely tricky to make the call. An issue that we sometimes have in Axum is also just when do we have enough like issues sort of piled up that require breaking changes to decide to ship a new breaking release? Because every time we do that, we know there's some amount of churn in the ecosystem that everybody has to update. I don't have a good framework for deciding when to do that. It's mostly just gut feeling for me personally with Axum.
Yeah, I understand what you're saying. It's kind of interesting. Like to me, I think like there must be a time when you're like, you know what? Okay, fine. There's no big breaking change. Like big breaking changes obviously make sense, but I mean, there must be lots of small changes where that could be okay. That you're fine to break stuff. It's like it's quite normal. Like you did Rails for 5 years. Every time we had a new Rails update or something, like of course there was always a change, but I think towards the end it was like less changes from you. It was more towards kind of like underneath the hood there was some more changes if I remember correctly.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I don't remember how Rails did their versioning, but it was definitely not semantic versioning. Like they would break APIs all the time, basically. You kind of never knew what you were going to get when there was a new version update. In Rust, there's definitely more an emphasis on semantic versioning. Like when if you ship a 1.0, like you sort of almost as a library maintainer live in constant fear of getting a question on Discord the day after you ship 1.0 that like we should totally fix this, but we can't without making a breaking change. And then even though it's a tiny breaking change, you still have to do a 2.0.
Yeah, I forgot about that. Yeah. Yeah, semantic. I mean, maybe we can talk a little bit about semantic, right? And that's about 1.0 stuff. So let's talk about semantic, right? So if you're at zero stage, that basically means okay, I'm free to experiment whenever I want. So just be prepared, right? We're talking about zero. We're talking about 0.x.x, right?
Yes, so I'm not an expert in semantic versioning, but I believe the website or spec, I don't know if you can call it that, says that 0.x, anything goes. You can basically do whatever you want.
We could talk about how you consider it to be, right? Because I don't think it'd be far off. And also lets people know like what they're in store for if they decide to start using Axum, or if they're already using it, what they're expecting, right? So basically, every time I upgrade, it's like expect the unexpected. Anything may happen, right? In terms of the APIs.
With Axum, no. Basically, the way that we do it at Axum, and I think most Rust libraries do this as well, is 1.0 means that the API is mature. People shouldn't expect it to change. Whereas And usually people will publish like, we won't make breaking changes within a year or 3 years or whatever. But typically 1.0 means, I don't want to say that it means that like it's a quality library, but there is a sense of like quality and maturedness, whatever, to it. What I then personally aspire to below that is that you can basically, if you have like 0.x, you can just drop the first zero, and then it's just, so in case of Axum is 0.5. So then that would be, that's just 5.0 basically. So if there's a new, like if the current version is 0.5.1, but we then do new features but no breaking changes, the next version would be 0.5.2. So it's almost like you can just drop the leading zero and say the current version of Axum is 5.1. And that also means that then when we eventually get to an actual 1.0, that's also a signifier to the community that you can now rely on this in different ways that you couldn't before. Like you can put Axum in a public API of a 1.0 crate, things like that. So when you upgrade if you upgrade a new like patch release, so the third number in Axum, you're not going to get any breaking changes. And if you do, please file an issue and then we'll revert it. That has happened twice, I think, but that was purely accidental. Whereas if the second number changes, then there will be breaking changes.
Yeah, okay. But if you have the first number change, that means definitely expect some breaking changes. We're doing a big upgrade, so be prepared, right?
Yes.
And like we talked about before, like when you have a 1.0 release, like I said, people are expecting something solid, like we said, production ready to go, right? And you feel that Axum is solid enough to use. Probably won't change so much, but no guarantees, right? But we're not quite ready to say that we're done churning out the APIs and how you actually interact with Axum, right?
Yes. I think the overall shape of the API is fairly stable. It hasn't changed in at least half a year. So when we make breaking changes, they're like minor things where upgrading is very trivial.
Okay, that's good to hear. I don't know, like maybe you can kind of talk a little bit about like how you guys. So when you got your design, right, are you also looking at like what Actix is doing and what other web frameworks are doing to get more of an idea about how should we approach this, especially with Rust, right? I mean, you could take a look, like you said, but we keep talking about Rust. I mean, you can take a look at Flask, etc. This is how they do it, and then you kind of take a look back, or are you saying, okay, I only look at maybe what Rust frameworks are doing because I'm dealing with Rust. It's going to be too different than other languages.
Yeah, I definitely look at the other frameworks. In the beginning, it was mainly what kind of features have they support for that I haven't thought about. It was also like, I want to do WebSockets. What could that look like? And then you can look at how Actix does it and how like Warp does it, which I think are two very different approaches. I believe if you're doing WebSockets with Actix, you have to use actors or something like that. Whereas with Warp, it's basically just a stream of events that you can read to and write from, which is also what Axum does, because I kind of like that API more. I don't look much. I look at Scala a little bit, but that's mostly just because I'm interested in sort of statically typed functional programming in that sense. And I think there's a lot of lessons to be had in that space. I look at Scala sometimes. I don't look much at what's going on with Ruby or Rails. I've looked a little bit at Fast API. I hear there's a lot of good things going on over there, and especially what they're doing with like type hints and generating documentation automatically from that kind of stuff. That's something that I'm interested in for sure. Another thing that I also do is just go to the issue trackers for the other repos and see like what issues are people having. Is that something that we can fix for Axum? I do that from time to time.
So other people's miseries is your kind of inspiration. Is that right?
Yep. I think probably the best decision that I made was to not include like TLS and HTTPS support in the box. If you want that, you have to basically roll your own. Which if you look at the issues for all the other repos, they have a lot of issues about HTTPS and TLS. Of course, there should be a nice crate that makes that possible, and there is. There's one called Axum Server built by a community member, but it just means that those are not issues that we have to deal with.
Yeah, that's right. So because you're built on top of Hyper, that means you actually don't need to have a front-facing proxy, right? So you should be looking at something to serve HTTPS. Is that correct?
Exactly. So if you have an HTTPS implementation that supports Hyper, you get Axum support for free.
Now, speaking of that, I do use a lot of, how do you say this? I use a lot of Kubernetes, so therefore I use Cert Manager, right? Now, is there a way to easily hook in some type of thing like a Cert Manager where you can manage your certificates, or is there not for something like this?
There probably is. I'm not much of an infrastructure guy, so I actually don't know.
Okay, yeah. Now, can you talk about some production use cases that people are actually using Axum? Like, do you know of anybody out there in the wild who's actually using it and willing to talk about it, or you can talk about the industries that they're using it in? I mean, you already said you're using it at work, right?
Yeah, so I work at Embark Studios, a Swedish game development company where we make games. We don't have any games that are public on the market yet, but we're building a bunch of things internally, and we use Axum for all our services, basically. I've heard of some people doing like video streaming. I've gotten questions from the 1Password people. I don't know if that means they're using it.
Usually means they're using it or examining it for use, right?
Yeah,
Depends on what
something like
kind of
that.
questions they're asking.
Yeah. But like the router that's in Tonic, so like the gRPC implementation, that is Axum. So if you're using Tonic in production, you're also using Axum in production.
That's pretty interesting. Speaking of Embark, I also want to talk to Embark at some point. So maybe I can ask you to hook me up with a good connection over there because they are doing some interesting stuff, right? They're like the
Yep.
only 100% Rust gaming company, I believe.
So we have 3 projects in development. One of those is all as like Rust the whole way through. And that's the project that I'm involved in.
Now, are you managing to keep more hair because of it? Because I can imagine if you're using C, C++, it could very much make you want to pull your hair out, you know?
Yeah, so there's most people who do Rust at Embark come from C++. Personally, I come from backend, so I've actually never written C++. So I still have all my hair. But I hear from people that Rust is definitely better. But there's, I think like we're using some physics stuff that's in C++, but otherwise everything is in Rust. Everything that we write ourselves is in Rust for that one more project that I'm involved in.
Now, I'm just kind of curious, like, is there a game engine that you guys are specifically using? Because I didn't look too much at it. Or do you guys have your own game engine?
We are doing our own thing in Rust, actually.
That's interesting. That's quite an endeavor too now.
Yep.
Okay, maybe we'll save that for an episode if we get that chance. Let's continue talking about Axum, right? Okay,
Yeah.
so yeah, Axum. I mean, it sounds pretty smooth. I mean, there was a book that I think it just got released or will be released from Manning about web development in Rust using Warp. So it's interesting to see that. I did kind of like using Warp. I don't know. I'm on the fence about it because it's tough for me to say. Like, I try to be open minded because every framework is different. The only thing I could say is like Flask and I forgot what the one in Ruby is. It's very thin. Do you remember what I'm talking about? Oh, a Sinatra. Sinatra and
Yeah.
Flask are definitely very similar. Of course, different way to write it, but they're very similar. I don't think Django and Rails are similar to me. I mean, there's quite big differences. Like Django comes with a built-in CMS and Rails does not. It's a huge difference
Yep.
already. And the way you
Yeah,
add
I've
new
never used
things.
Django.
I'm not a huge Python fan to begin with. I think I said that many times on the show, and it's yeah. Just know that if you're going to start Python, make sure everybody's using the same settings for tabs because you can really kill yourself going nuts with the white space.
Yeah, I imagine. I hate all the languages. It's just about which one you hate the least.
Oh, you hate Rust too? Oh no.
No, I like Rust. Sometimes I hate Rust, but generally I like it.
Maybe I think it's just the borrow checker that you don't really care for sometimes.
No, the borrow checker is fine. For me, it's trade objects that are very annoying. Like if I want to box a future, I have to decide up front if it's going to be send and sync or not. I wish that like you could just defer that decision to like figure that out later somehow. So that means like if you want to like Actix Web uses a single threaded Tokio runtime for like each CPU core, I believe. Whereas in Axum, we typically use a multi-threaded Tokio scheduler, which means that your futures have to be sent so you can send them across threads. And that means that there's like certain kinds of things in your futures that you can't do, like use RCs and non-thread safe locks and stuff like that. And that is sometimes a pain that people have. But I'm like, I really wish that we could support both use cases, both thread safe and not thread safe, but I don't know that we can because of trade objects. We basically have to duplicate all the code, but then remove plus send plus sync in a bunch of places.
So you actually are using a thread pool also within Axum. You're not using the default Tokio kind of style?
No. The Tokio does its own thing, but the futures that you sort of tell Axum to run, those have to be thread safe.
I think almost everything is thread safe, no, within Rust because of the way the borrow checker works, no?
I think the definition is that if a value implements the send and sync marker traits, then they are thread safe, which is not a limitation that Actix has because they don't send stuff across threads because there's only one runtime per CPU core or something like that. I'm not quite sure.
I just think about Rust guarantees, right? I mean, they're usually pretty good about kind of keeping this kind of stuff guaranteed, right? With RCs and maybe Ghost Cell as we kind of were talking about before.
Yeah, but like if you have an RC, you can't move that to another thread, which I guess that means it is not thread
Uh,
safe.
well, you wouldn't want to move it, right? You want to clone it and send the clone across the wire, right?
Yeah, you can never do that with an RC. Then you would want an ARC.
Yeah, yeah. Okay, fine. Again, you now this is down to semantics. Okay, you know what I mean? ARC. Okay. Yes, atomic reference count, not just a reference count, because this is
As
thread. Okay.
programmers, our jobs are to be very specific about stuff. So I'm sorry.
All right. I brought the pain to myself this time. I should have been on my game. I just say nothing and let you speak for the rest of the show now.
Nah, man, the borrow checker is easy. Once you learn it, I don't struggle with the borrow checker anymore personally.
Yeah, this is true. But the one thing that like really freaked me out, I think I mentioned this also on the show before, is like Clippy freaked the hell out of me. Not because I didn't know how to use it or whatever, but when I did use it, I was like, I got so many like errors that came up. And they weren't really errors, but they were definitely like, okay, be careful for these things. And I was like,
Yeah,
you know.
it's sort of a meme at work. We have a lot of people who like technical game designers and programmers who come to Rust for the first time, and they just hate Clippy with a fiery passion because they're like, just get out of my way, let me do my job. And we have a fairly strict Clippy lint for all our projects at work, so I feel you on that one for sure.
Just initially, but then afterwards, like I'm always running it, like every time I change a line to see if I messed up something. But in the end, I learned so much more Rust just because of Clippy. Like I was like,
Yep.
oh yeah, you could do this. Instead of pattern matching for okay, like the okay one from like the result, and just ignoring the inside, you can do that. That is okay within an if statement. I was like, oh, this is genius. So I didn't think about this before.
Yep.
So it's like, I know Rust is supposed to be small, but at the same time, like there's a lot of nice convenience methods that I never even thought about because I always heard Rust is so small. So
Yep.
I never even thought about that kind of stuff.
Yeah, I think Clippy is a really good teaching tool, actually.
Yeah, definitely. Okay. So is there any kind of like upcoming changes or stuff that's on the roadmap coming for Axum? I mean, or is it just kind of like keep hammering out more things, adding more small features here and there, maybe some more changing of the APIs?
I think the main sort of pillars that will be in Axum itself are there in the way that we want them to. So most of the changes that are happening these days are like small, nice to have utility kind of features, or like someone discovered that there is this bug and then we fix it, or that this API is sort of annoying to use, so then we fix that. There's a whole bunch of things in the ecosystem that I want to build on top of Axum. I don't have much time outside of work and Axum to actually do that. A feature that's been requested since day one, I think, is Swagger and OpenAPI support, which is something that I would love to have. Currently, I don't have time to build it. And the idea that I have and the way to do that doesn't require anything built into Axum, which means that technically it can be built by someone from the community. I've also been playing around with sort of an implementation of Phoenix Live View, but in Rust, built on top of Axum and WebSockets. And that's something that I'm really excited about as well. I think that is really cool. I just haven't had time to polish it and sort of finish it up. So most of the stuff that are in Axum are there and sort of in a good state. And then from that point on, it's about building more stuff on top of it.
Now, is there ever going to be an end to this? Because, like you said, like Axum is like every other framework where it has a very small kind of footprint of features, right? Is there like a place where it's like, okay, I'm definitely not going to get into like building templates, or I'm definitely not going to get into this or that, this kind of stuff?
Do you mean like how we decide whether to include templates or not, or?
I mean, right now you don't include it, right? Now, is that because you guys don't want to be into that landscape, or is it because you just haven't gotten the thing right yet? Or is it that you haven't chosen a specific library that you guys wanted to use? Like, I'm kind of curious. Like, this is just one specific question, right? The question is like, is there any areas that you're saying, okay, this is going to be up to you, but these things are what we're going to kind of make sure that, you know, if you're going to use X, you're going to use these pieces, etc.
I think it's all about choice. We choose not to include templating. We totally could if you wanted to. There is an element of, is it something that everybody needs? And if you're only doing JSON, then you probably don't need templates. You just need Saturday, basically. But then again, like WebSockets are included, but not everyone needs WebSockets. So it's mostly just kind of I think it's a balance of how much do people need it versus how difficult is it to build themselves.
Yeah, I feel like within the Rust community, WebSockets are just not that popular, and I'm not too sure why.
Yeah, I don't know either. I think WebSockets are really cool. And I think the async await and the futures and stream traits make WebSockets very easy, actually. I've played around a bit with WebSockets in Rails, and it's just such a pain. And like you have to write so much code. But in Rust, it's just a stream of events, and then Hyper figures out the rest.
Now, is this, you're playing around with this in Rails now, is this like the recent action cable or this is something else?
Yeah, so that was, I haven't done Rails in God knows 4 years, something like that. But it was definitely Action Cable.
Okay, I thought Action Cable was even more recent than that, but yeah, you're right. I think that came out around the time with when Phoenix came out for Elixir, if I
Yeah,
remember
I think you're
correctly.
right. I think
Yeah,
so.
because I think before that you had to use Fiber or something crazy like that, or what was that name? Do you? I mean, you must know what I'm talking about. It's like Fiber something, microfiber. Is that what it was
Yeah,
called?
yeah, maybe. I never really did much WebSockets in Ruby actually. I know there's also just a bunch of overhead from having lots of connections open, and that was a concern that people had for a long time, which people don't seem to be concerned about Rust. That element of it is just really easy in Rust.
Yeah, well, that's good to hear. Yeah, I mean, we've had a good session for nearly an hour. Is there? Sorry, no, don't want to say I don't want to drown and kill this off, but I don't think I have any more questions on my side. I mean, is there anything you wanted people to kind of to know to kind of come and check out the recent release, or to how to connect with you, or anything like that?
Definitely check out the documentation. There's quite a bit of docs, I would say, sometimes too much. Sometimes, like, honestly, the reason that I write the amount of docs that I do is that I can just link to stuff when people ask questions. We're always trying to make the docs better and make them more approachable to beginners in Rust as well. Like I mentioned before, often newcomers to Rust, their first big crate is a web framework. So we want our docs to be easy to understand for beginners and not just for people who are very familiar with Rust. But otherwise, yeah, check out the docs. Check out there's like 40-ish examples in the GitHub repo. If you have any questions, you can come to the Tokyo Discord. There's an Axum channel there where I'm usually hanging out all day. Yeah.
Okay, well, that's good. All right, well, definitely appreciate your time, and it's good to finally have some more understanding about what is this Axum thing and why do we have yet another framework. But maybe there's definitely a place I think in people's hearts for this, and maybe this could be the one that maybe I'm going to use. I don't know. Still need some time to at least play with all of them to see what I like more. Not too sure. Maybe Axum just because it's already in the ecosystem of Tokyo, like you said. Also, you already have your choice, right? Your choice is
I mean, my choice is Axum.
yeah. And is this because you work on it, or is it because you really? I mean, it's probably a different fit for what you're looking for, right?
Yeah, I mean, I built it to fit the needs that I have, so it works very well for my needs, sort of in the design.
Yeah, this is true. Okay.
Warp is interesting, and I would like to technically understand how it works, which I don't currently. But I definitely think that if you want to get stuff done, I think Axum is a good choice.
If you want to get stuff done, not that you can't get things done in other frameworks, right?
I didn't say that. I didn't say that.
It's definitely very great to have you on and to meet you. And you reached out to me. So if anybody else in the audience wants to come on the show, work on something interesting, reach out to me. It's totally fine. I'm looking for new guests all the time. And yeah, again, thank you for your time. Denmark is on my list. It's on my list to go. I want to go to Europe someday. I've never been to Europe, so try a real Denmark Danish sometime.
You should come. We have the best Danishes.
I would hope so. Otherwise, I'd be really let down. Like, kind of, how can I have a Danish in Denmark and it not be good? That'd be a big issue.
I was in the US, like, I think the year before COVID, and we had Danishes there, and we were both, like, my girlfriend and I were both like, these are not Danishes at all. Like, we want to go home and have a proper Danish, so I can take you out and show you what a real Danish is.
Finally. It's just like Chinese food in US. I lived in China, I lived in Hong Kong. Chinese food in US, Chinese food over here is totally different. Just kind of whatever hits your palate, right, for the local cuisine.
Yeah.
So we Americanized it. And you're saying we made it worse? Maybe something wrong with your taste bud, man. Everything's good in US.
Not necessarily worse, but more like different. And then you say that it's from Denmark, and then it's not, and then that's like weird.
Yeah, it's from some guy named Chuck in the kitchen.
Most likely, yeah.
Yeah, who's not even Danish, not even a little bit. Okay, again, thank you for your time, and we should probably catch up again once. I think once we have a 1.0 of Axum, we should finally talk about your experiences with making 1.0 and what was the choice, what was the final moment that said, okay, let's do this.
For sure. Thanks for having me.